Mr. Hollinshead,
Aye, here.
Mrs. Cordero,
Here.
Mrs. Flores,
Here.
Mr. Valencia,
Here.
Mr. Lara.
Here. Item B, Pledge of Allegiance. Could we all please stand, and Mr. Valencia, can you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance? Bless you.
Thank you. Allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America, and to the
for
republic
which it
for
stands,
which it stands, one nation, under God,
indivisible, with
with
liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Item C, report from closed session. Conference with labor negotiators, CSCA, information was shared. Item B, conference with labor negotiators and SMEA, information was shared. Item 4, public comments, open session. The public comments are intended for members of the public to address the Board of Education on items involving the school district. Such testimony shall be limited to 3 minutes each, 450 words per person and subject, and 15 minutes total each topic. If an answer to a specific question is requested, the board president will appropriate direct administration to respond in writing. Do we have any public comments, Mr. Beecher?
We do have a request to speak, but it is during our public hearing.
Okay,
So when we get to that item, then we can welcome our guest in to share with us.
perfect. Item A, comments on agenda items? None? Approval of agendas presented. Do I have a motion?
I second.
Who moved? I didn't hear.
Linda
Linda
Oh.
made the motion.
Ms.
I
Cordero
second.
made the motion. Ms. Flores second. Roll call?
Mr. Hollinshead,
Aye.
Mrs. Cordero,
Aye.
Mrs. Flores, Mr. Valencia,
Aye.
Mr. Lara.
Aye. Motion passes. Item 6, public hearing, input regarding compositions of maps for trustee area elections. Mr. Beecher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lara. There are several steps to the process of preparing, receiving public comment, public input, and then providing versions of potential trustee area maps. To share with us tonight, we have Todd Robbins from AALRR, an expert law firm involving this type of formation, but also in education law. What I'd like to ask is to allow Mr. Robbins to share what he has with the school board tonight, kind of walking through the procedures that are out and part of this structure. And then after his presentation, allow our speaker to join us. Mr. Robbins is in a couple different places at once, and he's going to join us and then need to tie into another board meeting immediately after that. So if we could please welcome Mr. Robbins.
Good evening, Mr. Robbins. Welcome.
Good evening, Board President. Thank you for having me, and the rest of the board. Thank you. It's good to see you. Tonight, we're going to review the process for transitioning to by-trustee area elections. Tonight is the first pre-map public hearing, which we will discuss that process in more detail in just a couple of slides. So if you go ahead and go to the next slide. Part of the rationale for why we're here tonight is that there are 3 methods of election that the Education Code allows school districts to use. The first is at-large elections. That's what the school district currently uses. And that's where all the board members are voted for and elected by the voters who reside within the district's boundaries, irrespective of where they live within the district boundaries. We're transitioning to by-trustee area elections. The from-trustee area elections is not a viable method to use in this process, so we're not going to spend any time on it. The by-trustee area method of election is where the district is divided into 5 geographic trustee areas, and each trustee will need to reside within one of those 5 trustee areas, and only the residents who reside within those geographic trustee areas could vote for the trustee who also resides within that area. So a little bit of the why we're here tonight. Go ahead to the next slide. The California Voting Rights Act, it essentially calls into question at-large elections. Back in 2001, when this was passed, the legislature stated its intent to ensure that at-large elections were not being used in a way that impairs the ability of protected classes to elect candidates of their choice or influence the outcome of their elections. A student of history would know that at-large election have been used as a means to suppress or dilute the voting strength of protected class citizens throughout the United States. And so California was also responding to that with its passage of the California Voting Rights Act. We're not going to get into too much detail about violations of the Voting Rights Act because the district's taking a proactive step in moving forward with the transition process. So if you could go to the next slide. And the next slide, please. So the process for transitioning to by-trustee area elections is prescribed by both the Education Code and the Elections Code. Go ahead to the next slide. First, the Education Code allows for 3 different ways to trigger the process if you're doing it proactively. One, it can be initiated by a petition of the electorate. It could also be initiated by the County Committee on School District Organization. But the reason I've bolded the 3rd option is because that's what you're doing. You've initiated the process when you passed your resolution of intent to transition back in a board meeting late last year. And this option gives the district the most local control over the process, which in this process is a good thing. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So the Elections Code is also a driver of the process, and it provides the procedural things that we are required to comply with. So tonight we are in what's called a pre-map public hearing situation. Elections Code 10010 requires us to have 2 pre-map public hearings, and it actually says in the statute, before any maps are drawn, we must have these public hearings. So this is where we are asking the community to provide any input on any considerations we should factor in when maps are ultimately drawn. So for example, are there any natural geographic features within the boundaries of your school district that we should take into consideration when drawing lines? Are there neighborhoods that we should consider and ensure that those neighborhoods stay together to the best extent possible? This is not a process that impacts attendance, nor is it a process that impacts transportation. So we're simply looking for comments that relate to where lines should be drawn for purposes of dividing up the district into 5 areas. Once we've had those 2 public hearings, the district then is required to publish at least 1 proposed map. And then after we've published those proposed maps, we're then required to hold 2 additional public hearings to gather feedback on those proposed maps. And then ultimately, we will be asked to select a map once we've completed that 2nd public hearing phase of the process. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So once the maps are published, we strongly recommend that the maps go on to the district's website for 24/7 review and comment. That's a very common practice in all of the districts that have gone through this process. The district can also hold community input meetings where you could do it virtually or you could do it in person, depending on how safety conditions are in your area. And this is an option. We don't have a lot of time to do this, so it may not be feasible, but it is an option where you could have community input meetings outside of a board meeting if you feel like that's necessary. But we feel like the website option has been a valuable resource for people to be able to provide feedback. And so that's a good option. Go ahead to the next slide. So after you've completed the public hearing phase, which is the pre-map public hearing phase and then the post-map public hearing phase, the board will be asked to adopt one of the maps as its own, and that will become the new trustee area map for the Santa Maria Bonita School District for the next approximately nine years. The board will also adopt a resolution announcing its transition from at-large to by-trustee area elections. And within that resolution, you'll be asking the Santa Barbara County Committee on School District Organization to come in to your district boundaries if they are doing in-person meetings. Some county committees are still doing virtual meetings, and to approve your process. Go ahead to the next slide. They need to hold at least one public hearing within your boundaries, and they will then approve a resolution that will either approve or reject the district's proposal. And then there's a default within the education code that's cited there that the county committee calls for an election on a very narrow question of whether the district should or should not transition to by-trustee area elections. And we'll talk about that for just a minute, but I will point out before we even get into it that no district has ever had that election, and I'll explain why in just a few minutes. Go ahead to the next slide. So like I said, it's the default for the county committee to call for an election on the question of should the district transition. And on the next slide, the education code prescribes the language that we actually would have to put on the ballot. And it would be these two questions: for the establishment of trustee areas in the Santa Maria Bonita School District, yes, or for the establishment of trustee areas in Santa Maria Bonita School District, no. But like I mentioned, no school district has ever put this question to an election because there's substantial risk. So go ahead to the next slide. If the voters reject the transition to by-trustee area election, the district would continue as an at-large elections district and would still be susceptible to demand letters and other legal challenges under the California Voting Rights Act. So there's a solution to avoid this uncertainty. Like I said, 100% of the school districts that have gone through this process, and it's a lot of school districts that they have undertaken. So go ahead to the next couple of slides, please. One more. There's a waiver that we are allowed to seek. Prior to this year, we used to get the election waiver from the California State Board of Education. It became so commonplace for the State Board of Education to consider these waivers that instead of individual action items, they put it on their agenda as consent items and would adopt those waivers in batches. So that gives you kind of an idea as board members who deal with a consent calendar, how routine these waiver requests became. The legislature passed SB 442 last year, which allows us to seek the waiver instead from the Santa Barbara County Committee on School District Organization. So in our resolution that we adopt at the end of the school district's process, we will ask the county committee to grant that waiver for us so that we don't need to hold that election. If you go to the next slide, we recommend as part of the process for seeking the waiver that the district consult with the bargaining units. This is a requirement under the old State Board of Education process, but we're recommending that you carry it forward even though it's not legally required because it does establish some best practices. So consult with the bargaining units, get their position on the issue, and also consult with appropriate advisory committees such as your bilingual advisory committee, your DLAC, your LCAP committees, and any other local committees in the school district that you feel would be important for providing feedback. Go ahead to the next slide. We also recommend, even though it's not required under the county committee waiver process, that the board hold at least one public hearing on the topic of the waiver request. And that's to give the community the opportunity to provide feedback. And at a subsequent meeting, I'll be happy to provide a presentation just on the waiver issue again, so that it gets called out and that if anybody has any questions on it, they can ask those and then they can come prepared for a subsequent public hearing. All right, go ahead. It's important, and I put this slide in here because back in the in-person days, I'd been pulled over at several board meetings by community members saying, we don't want to waive our right to vote for our school board members. And of course, we're not asking people to waive their right to vote for school board members. We're simply asking for a waiver of that very narrow question of should we transition or not. And again, that's become a routine part of the process. Go ahead to the next slide. We generally estimate that the time frame for completion of the process between the district's process and the county committee's process is between 4 and 6 months. We're probably going to push the envelope a little bit on that and probably be done in 2 to 3 months. I think we're probably going to target a late March or early April county committee meeting in your school district in order to be able to give the registrar of voters enough time to get your paperwork ready for candidate filing deadlines and things like that for the 2022 election. Next slide, please. One thing that's important to note is that once we transition, if the board ultimately goes that route, the current terms of the trustees are not impacted. So we will transition and start running by-trustee area elections in November of 2022. Those of you who are on the board until 2024 will remain on the board regardless of how the boundary lines end up. You get to complete your term. It's hard to kind of postulate or guess how that how the maps may impact you currently without actually seeing the maps and seeing where you live in relation to one another. So I don't want to speculate on that, but just know that if you're on the board until 2024, you will remain on the board until 2024. Next slide. And then I mentioned that these maps will be our maps for the next approximately 9 years. And that's because once the next census happens in 2030, we'll be required to adjust, if necessary, our boundaries. And the reason I say if necessary is because once we start looking at maps, you'll find that we are allowed a variance between the largest area and the smallest area of 10%. And if after the decennial census in 2030, we are still within that 10% variance, we don't have to do anything to the map. But if your population has either grown or shrunk or has moved around within the district and that variance goes outside of that 10% maximum, then we would need to move lines here and there in order to get ourselves back into that 10% or less variance balance. And so with that, I'm happy to take any questions if you have any.
Anybody have any questions for Mr. Robbins?
I have one question.
Sure.
You mentioned that there must be a public hearing where you basically explain about the resolution to transition to trustee areas without, I think, without voting on it, public voting on it. Is that correct?
Yeah, so that's the waiver process.
Okay, the waiver process.
Right.
My question is, can that be done at the same time as the presentation to the county committee? Or
No, that public, I'm sorry.
Must it be done prior to going to the county?
So the waiver public hearing would need to happen before going to the county committee so that we can get feedback from your stakeholders and your voters, and then put within the resolution that the board will approve, that you will approve, that we held the public hearing and that we are requesting the waiver from the county committee.
Okay, got it.
Good question. Thank you.
I don't have a question. I just want to know if you'll share the PowerPoint with us, maybe through our memo, just so I can kind of visit it one more time to understand it a little clearer.
Certainly. Your superintendent has a copy of it. And
Okay.
if he's inclined, I have no problems if he would want to put that on the website as well for the community to be able to review it at their leisure.
Okay, appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll definitely do that. And we can, I think it was in December, we had our first consideration of this process, and we can put that one out there as well so that, you know, we can establish a record of the
Great.
conversations we've had for people to refer to. Thank you for that. Mhm.
A question that I have is, you had mentioned that we're going to be expediting the process, something that typically takes 4 to 6 months to 2 to 3 months. And I'm just wondering if that gives us enough time to do the process effectively where our community members are involved. I know there's other kind of similar processes taking place at a community college, for example, or even, you know, in our local city government.
Yeah.
So I know that this is on the minds of many of our community members, but I'm just curious if 2 to 3 months will give our community members enough time to digest the information, to give quality feedback. What are your thoughts on that?
I actually think that condensing the timeline increases the likelihood that you would have more engagement, because it's fresh on people's minds. In my experience, when it becomes drawn out, there may be an interest at the beginning, and then people would tend to fade away over time. And so I don't think you're shortchanging your community by, you know, and when I say expedite, I mean, because of where we are in the calendar currently and the need to meet the registrar of voters deadlines, we're going to need to hold some special meetings in order to get through this process rather than just go on your regular monthly board schedule. And so that's going to be really the only difference. That 4 to 6 month calendar is built on the assumption that a school district that we're working with generally only has one board meeting per month.
Something that I wanted to point out, Todd, is that we've had excellent community participation for example, right now we're going through a superintendent search process.
Yeah.
However, one thing that we are noticing is that some of our families who are less tech savvy need a lot of support. So I'm not sure if it's a good idea to rely on just engagement through our website.
Yeah.
I think we might definitely have to lean on some community input sessions.
Yeah.
Even though we're on an expedited session.
Yeah.
Because for some of our families, it's just too cumbersome to navigate that process.
That makes good sense.
Todd, if you mind, I'd like to ask a question that Linda's question prompted for me.
Sure.
Connected to the public hearing, would it be possible to connect that waiver related public hearing to, say, our next pre-map public hearing?
What I would recommend is that if necessary, I can give a dedicated waiver presentation, which is basically just what was in this presentation. So it's up to you if you feel it's necessary at the next pre-map public hearing. And if you don't feel like that's necessary, yes, you could absolutely combine the two. That would be fine.
Okay, thank you. And I wouldn't necessarily, what I would propose is that we have 2 separate public hearings scheduled at the same meeting.
That's what I mean. You could combine
absolutely.
them at the same meeting. Yeah.
And that way, and I like the idea of having you be available because there are some good questions from folks who are concerned about elections, trustee areas, and waivers, and to have your expertise to really explain how this is a component of the process that's used almost 100% of the time, if not 100% of the time, will really be helpful as we do navigate in a compressed timeline.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
In fact, what I can do is I can send you a separate PowerPoint tomorrow that just highlights the waiver process that you could just go ahead and put up on your website so people could read through that as a dedicated information piece. And feel free to bug me about that if I don't get it to you.
Will do. Thank you.
Yes.
Well, I know we on this item, if there aren't more questions, we do have a member of the community who wants to weigh in during the public hearing. And if there aren't more questions, I'll ask Brian to welcome her into the board meeting for us. Sound good? Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm just going to peek out and check my status out in the other room, and I'll be right back.
Thank you very much.
Are they in?
They're coming right now.
Good evening.
Ms. Garcia.
Hello,
you
good
with us?
evening. Yes,
Hi.
I'm here.
Thank you so much.
Should I?
Thank you. I'll just start by saying thank you so much for your patience while we allowed our council to participate in 2 board meeting presentations at one time. And so please do share with the board your input during this public hearing. The floor is yours.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'm excited to be hearing about how this process will function. And yeah, I find all of it very interesting. But yeah, good evening to you all. My name is Rebecca Garcia. I'm a policy advocate with CAUSE. If you're not yet familiar with our work, we're a community organization that advocates for working class and immigrant families across a variety of issues. And in these months, we have especially been engaged in redistricting processes at many levels, making sure that folks from our community have access to meetings just like this one. Most recently, our youth leaders held a town hall with members of the Santa Maria Joint Union High School District Board. And in that process, we were specifically advocating to keep farm working neighborhoods in the northwest of Santa Maria together. I mention all of this because from the city and high school redistricting processes, we have learned that there are key attributes when identifying communities of interest in Santa Maria. And we really think that looking closely at this following list will be crucial in creating representative maps in this process. So some of those things include looking at where there are families that speak Spanish, Mixteco, or another indigenous language, primarily in their homes. Also looking where are there families that depend on free and reduced lunches, as well as looking at where farm workers reside, right? Or in this case, like there's a shared workforce. And lastly, where are there first generation students living? And this can include culturally, but also in familiarity with the California school system, right? And parents who are new and are learning, something I'm sure you all are very aware of. And so we'll have more specific input in the coming hearings, and we're excited to do so. But for now, I can say with certainty that we really believe there needs to be a strong Northwest district, since that's a group of people that are really connected by similar linguistic and cultural backgrounds, as well as most of the criteria that I listed. And so, yeah, thank you for your time. I'm excited to hear more about this timeline and what you all would like to consider as you draft maps in the near future. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Robbins. Thank you very much, Ms. Garcia. We appreciate your input tonight. And I don't know, board, if you have any other input you'd like to offer.
I did have a follow-up for Mr. Robbins, if he's available, or I'm not sure if he stepped out to the other meeting.
He's still
Sorry,
here.
I'm still here.
Mr. Robbins, something that I noticed was that at the Santa Maria Joint Union High School District, I believe they had, I think, up to 4 opportunities for public comment for the community. Will we be able to achieve that, or given our truncated timeline, will that not be possible anymore?
The mandatory process has 4 opportunities for you. So you'll have at least 4.
Gotcha. So it sounds like that's built into our
That's right.
process.
Yeah.
That's right.
Excellent. Thank you for clarifying that.
Yep, you're welcome.
And this tonight was the first night to make sure that we had that public hearing. That is that public opportunity for input. Graciously, Ms. Garcia did join us. And so that is step 1. And it sounds like there's been a request for Mr. Valencia from you to make sure that we do something more than just online, which this is our venue right now, to make sure we have that outreach.
Well, if I have anything that comes to mind, I'll reach out to you, Mr. Beecher, to get a hold of Mr. Robbins. I'll have to go through this, like Vita said, once we get it shared with us, revisit it, and being it's new. I mean, it's not new, but for our district being putting boundaries in. So I have nothing at the moment.
I think if we do those remote sessions, we need to be sure that we have a template so that the information we give is consistent and obviously as complete as possible, but also that we're giving the information the same each place. Because there's a likelihood that we'll have to have considerations for having multiple spots because of distancing or what have you, and wanting to be safe for our community members that attend. We'll want to be respectful of that, but also respectful of the fact we want to make sure that they all get the same in-depth information, that they don't feel like they're getting different levels of responses or what have you. That would be my only thing, because I agree with you, Mr. Valencia. I think we'd like to think that everybody can go online, and also traditionally the community has turned out for these kinds of things site-wise, or what have you. So I think we should. That's definitely something we should endeavor to do.
Well,
Unmuted myself.
Thank you.
It would seem to me that, the things that Ms. Garcia mentioned were fairly global. And while she pointed out that the Northwest area, needs to have a very distinct representation, I would maintain that, if we're looking at free and reduced lunch, that I don't think there's a school in our district that doesn't have at least 70% of their total population that qualifies. And of course, all of our students receive free lunch. We are part of that program. There is some variation in terms of how many percentage of Spanish-speaking students that we have in our schools, but every one of our schools has a very significant, above 50% number. So without looking at specific data, in regards to our population within our school district boundaries, while there will be some variances, I personally don't think we'll have a district that wouldn't be primarily Hispanic, which is, what do we call the group that, the group that wants to be represented, the minority group, if you will. So, I wouldn't even know where to begin to look if I were thinking about, how to divvy up Santa Maria, and would probably be helpful just if we had a map on our website that just showed where the boundaries are for the entire school district.
That's available, and I can share with you the link in the Friday update this weekend.
Okay.
We do have a tool that I use every once in a while, and when I do, I'm really impressed. We have a boundary locator tool where a family can put in their address and determine which school is their school of residence for elementary and junior high.
Actually, I use that on the website.
So that one does show with either just pastel or with satellite where our district boundaries are that can give that orientation. But Ms. Cordero, you bring up a really good point. At this level, in this boardroom, we aren't necessarily going to need to dig into the demographic data that is inherent within our community. We have cooperative strategies. We'll be working with Mr. Robbins to make sure that we have a solid understanding of who our voters are, because that's who we're going to be looking at as we go through this process. And then, what information is available about those voters through the registrar's office. And then that's the information that they'll use to, shape, given the input that we've received from the public. And so the attributes that Ms. Garcia mentioned are absolutely on point. That's one of the things we need to be mindful of, that the demographer will need to be mindful of as they're shaping these things. Because I think the language that's in the presentation talks about protected class, right? To make sure that members of a protected class have their opportunity to have their voice heard in the process. And so that's why this is important for us to get right on track starting tonight. And then with the compressed timeline, and Mr. Valencia, I appreciate your question. And I was really pleased with Mr. Robbins' answer that a compressed timeline allows for a higher level of engagement because each piece in the process is in sequence and in proximity to every other piece of the process. So with that, I am also excited to see what these maps might look like, but there's one more public hearing we have to have at least before we can bring out those maps to make sure that we have an opportunity for the public to provide their input. And then that next point will be after that, after we gather that input, where we get to actually start looking at what maps might look like. So thank you for that comment. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from, Linda. I think, the difficulty is that the spirit in which this has come about is that protected class and trying to make sure that there are people whose voice is heard and they're empowered. And I think we who live in this community tend to think of it in some of those broad terms that, or at least we understand some of those broad terms, I should say, that Ms. Garcia brought up. So I think hopefully that when she comes back with cause and some of the other community members and associations come back to present us with their thoughts, that they'll be able to help us or give us more information as to where some of the delineations lie, where some of those subtleties that maybe we haven't yet, or we don't know about, may lie, so that there is something maybe that contributes to drawing those lines outside of just the concentration of population, and that hopefully the demographers will take consensus information that's fairly broad, but maybe they'll be able to kind of, if you will, kind of coax out some things that might help us with some of those decisions too. Because I think that the main thing we want to do is communicate to our community that we want them to feel that their voice is heard. And so I think we're lucky. I think our process and our job is going to be a little easier than the high school districts, because they have a bunch of other close districts that they encompass that feed into them, and so they had to take those things into consideration. And listening to what Ms. Garcia said about the northwest part of town, there were things with Northwest being affiliated with Guadalupe because they had to expand out, and Los Alamos and those areas being incorporated, or what have you, with, say, probably with orchids and stuff. So I think we're lucky if the map that Ms. Cordero asked about is presented, then I think that gives people a visual. So I think that visual is going to be helpful, and then when we start to get the information, it'll hopefully seem fairly straightforward, but also I think it'll make people feel good about where they are. I don't know, that's just my 2 cents. Probably maybe like 3.5 cents.
Well, the next question for me is, when would be the timeline for our next meeting going forward with this?
Correct. We have a schedule of
Because we got a pretty tight schedule this February.
Yeah, there's quite a bit coming up.
Mhm.
What we're working to do is try and tie into existing meetings to the greatest extent possible. And so there are several meetings calendared already. We have a meeting on February 9th. I believe we have a meeting on February the 23rd. Is that the right date? 23rd. The next one is March is it the 10th or the 9th? 9th. And then originally as a regular board meeting, we had was that the 24th? March 24th? Was that regular board meeting we talked about this afternoon?
That's a Thursday.
23rd. So the
23rd.
23rd was on our calendar as a regular board meeting, and we had pulled it off. But we're going to talk about making sure we add that one back in to make sure actually for that one, we need to add that one in related to the ability to continue to operate our board meetings in remote because the 30-day calendar needs a little boost on the 24th to get all the way through to April. So since we have to call that meeting for that item anyways, if we needed another meeting to ask for input, that would be one we could add in to make sure we get it. Okay. But we do have, we talked about this earlier this week, kind of a calendar for board meetings and agenda items to make sure that everything, and each of you have heard all the moving pieces that are kind of out there for us, including the superintendent search, to make sure that we have all of our items captured and on the calendar, and that we do as much as we can to balance those items so that we don't overwhelm our time here, but also make sure that nothing slips. We capture every item that needs the board's consideration. So know that we're working on that piece too.
Okay. I'm just going through my calendar to look everything that's tied up. Anybody else? Any other questions?
I couldn't quite hear you.
Oh,
Most of the ones, at least through February, were in that last memo, the last Friday memo, including all the superintendent, but I mean both.
There's a lot of work.
And I did want to verify the time on the, was it the 9th, no, 10th, and the 11th?
she's muted. I can't hear her.
Ms.
I
Flores,
wanted to
question?
verify the time start of one of the February meetings later on. It just came to me. It's not to do that. February the 3rd, I do know.
Yeah.
I can't hear her.
You can't hear. What she's saying is that at the February 3rd meeting, you'll be determining the time for the 10th and the 11th.
Oh, okay. Thank you. All right. Okay. We're good, Mr. President.
Okay.
One good thing is we have 5 Wednesdays in March.
Thanks for that, Linda.
Well, it does give us quite a few options. If
That's true.
Wednesdays.
Oh, man.
Personally, I'll probably try to leave them clear just in case.
Yeah. Okay. No other questions? No? Okay, well, there's nothing for me to read out as far as accepting this. At this time, the Board of Education of Santa Maria Bonita School District will conduct a public hearing in accordance with the election code 10010 to receive, consider input regarding the composition of trustee area maps to be used in the event the board approves the transitions to by-trustee area elections pursuant to Education Code Section 5019 and 5020. Mr. Beecher?
The public hearing would be closed.
There it is.
Adjourn?
That's next. Adjourn is next.
Adjourn meeting.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.